Welcome back to the glorious return of How Made. You know, it's been a while since I made these videos, but I think it's time that we finally show how the new TPOT intro that's all in between and 24 frames per second was made. So I'm going to start out by just showing you time lapses of how I did it. And this is playing at 100 times speed. This is faster than animation really happens, believe it or not. I'm just taking the original animation, which is really good. It's by CobyPal, who made both the music and the animation, just a generational talent. And all I wanted to do is just take those drawings and then in between them. So I think anyone who was like originally attached to the original version, the goal is that you should be okay with how it looks now, that I've just taken the original and just added more drawings in between. Hopefully the original soul and character to it is the same. Originally, I thought CobyPal had made this in some other program that wasn't Adobe Animate. So I was like thinking, oh man, I'm going to have to like extract them from some other program and import them into Animate, which I do know how to use. But thankfully, they gave me the FLA and everything was just hunky-dory. So as I'm going through these frames, I am using a brush stabilizer that I really like, Hey Stylus. I used to use a different one that was for Windows, but for Mac, it's Hey Stylus that I really like. I think there's really no other way that I could have drawn these lines to be stable as they are. Like when I originally made the original BFB, I actually was using a Cintiq 24 inches, I think, that automatically smoothed out the lines. So I didn't really need a brush stabilizer. It stabilized everything for you. Now, newer tablets are a lot more sensitive and they don't fix your issues because they will pick up every little minor vibration of your hand. So I recommend using a brush stabilizer. That's like an instant way to just make your lines as if it's like a vector drawing. Another thing that I really like about Adobe Animate is the drawing objects mode. If you press J, that's how you can make it so that different shapes as you draw them are not going to automatically merge with each other. That's another thing that I thought was like, you just have to use if you're going to be doing any sort of frame by frame drawing in Adobe Animate. There's like a few shortcuts that I really want to go over that I think if you want to animate frame by frame with the brush tool, with shapes, and you're drawing the whole time, that you really are going to be using over and over again. And I really like the J key to switch drawing objects being on and off. I really like the Shift Y shortcut for switching to the pencil tool. And of course the B shortcut to switch to the brush tool, but also the X key to swap the shape and stroke colors. You can see everything about this recording has changed all of a sudden because I've skipped ahead from 2024 to 2025. Suddenly I'm using light mode now and my hairstyle is different. And it's really just because I just got tired of working on it and I just kind of shelved it for a while. So I was really working on this FLA like on and off. But now here we are in the current year. At this point, all of the in-betweening is done of the main characters, and I have now just moved to just in-betweening the background, which I thought like shouldn't be that hard because it's just simple shapes. It's one color drawings, but there's like a lot going on. And so it ended up being a little bit more work than I thought it would be. I'm in-betweening the background and I'm doing my best to like imitate the cool sketchy style that CobyPal has. I've sort of tried at times to not make it too smoothed over. I will say with the drawings of the hands that I am like trying to make the hands look a little bit more stable just because a little bit of variation will make the whole thing look a little bit wobbly. So why not just sort of try to bring it back to a more stable average shape of the hand. Even though I'm drawing like these like random watery sketches, I'm still using the mode that makes every brush stroke its own object, just because if I want to move a stroke but it's already overlapping another stroke, I want to keep it so that these different shapes can be selected and moved independently. And you can see on my timeline, I'm using shape tween. So I'm not really going the full Monty of like drawing everything, but I think at some point you do have to use the tools that are given to you in the world of Adobe Animate, which includes shape tweens. I think earlier in my recordings, I am still using shape tweens for a lot of the foreground animations too. There's still a lot of work that you have to do when you're using shape tweens, especially if you have characters that are not like trivially simple because you have to break them apart into different shapes and then shape tween those different shapes and contours separately from each other. So there's still a lot of work that goes into shape tweening them. It's just a different type of work. I'm going to skip ahead to, where the recording is not bugged. And you can see that a lot of the work here is just separating apart those body parts and praying that the shape tween feature in Adobe Animate is not going to break and is going to not turn each shape tween into a nightmare mess that sometimes happens when you have shapes that have a lot of points. Another shortcut that I really like, which I don't think Adobe Animate has by default, I set it up to make it so that Command Option Shift C, it's like making a shape with my fingers like this. It'll open up the Optimize Shapes feature. And I think that is really useful if you're using shape tweens, because those break if you're shape tweening shapes with a lot of points. And even though optimizing your shape will change the shape a little bit, it's a lot better to have a shape that's slightly different that actually works with the shape tween tool that has fewer points than to have one where the shape tween doesn't work at all. And the thing that I like about being able to optimize it is that if you literally set the strength to just 1 out of 100, it'll still simplify it a lot. Maybe I'm like misremembering, maybe 1 actually is like the strongest, but I just like to set it at 1 because I like to think that's the gentlest you can possibly optimize something. And yet, even if you set it to 1, it's going to take away like half the points or maybe even 80% of the points. Just anything for the shape tween feature to still work is good by me. Okay, so now this thing has looped over again. You know what? Why not just go through a second pass, because there's a lot of things that I've missed. And each time we watch this whole time lapse, I'm probably going to discover something new that I talked over the first time around. And one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that those keyframes, if you notice those keyframes in the timeline that are green, every green keyframe that I have in here is a new drawing. I decided if I'm going to go into this FLA and add new drawings, I'm not going to remember which ones I added and which ones Colebones originally drew. So I'm thinking, let's use the feature where you can select a keyframe and give it a name and give it a comment. So every new keyframe, I'm going into the name field of that keyframe and hitting //I. And that just means the 2 slashes adds a comment to your frame. If you just start typing there without the 2 slashes, Adobe Animate is going to give you an error when you try to export it, because if you have different keyframes that have the same name to them, it's going to give an error. So comments, you can have different keyframes have the same stuff written in the comment. So that's why I'm using the comment feature. And then I is just the shortest possible comment you could possibly write. That's 1 character. So that's what turns those keyframes green. I'm glad that I did that early on, because otherwise I would not remember which drawings I added and which ones Colebones originally had. So this whole time I'm trying to sort of replicate Colebones' style. There are some things that I have sort of adjusted to match my own preferences a bit. I did notice a lot of these motions have objects pop out of the screen right before they leave the screen. And I thought, let's add a little bit of extra follow through and make sure that an object, you see the very last sliver of it before it finally disappears. Same thing with when objects enter the screen. There were a lot of cases where I felt like objects were just sort of popping into the screen without making their full entrance. And I felt like in animation, the follow through and the anticipation of something is what tells you the most about the action that you're seeing, about to see, and have just seen. I did want to try to make the drawings as faithful to the original as possible. If you could reconstruct the original Colebones animation from the in-between version. For the most part, all of those keyframes are there. I don't think I've deleted any keyframes, but some of them have been shifted around. Here you can see that is something that I very rarely do, which is have a stroke object in Adobe Animate where you have one part of the stroke being thinner than the other. I think that probably will help if you're using the brush tool and you feel like you can't really control your hands that well. Here I'm just, thoroughly still using the object drawing mode, because I feel like that just lets you change the position and scale and rotation of a stroke or drawing, even if it's overlapping with something else. And so here I have actually re-enabled the brush sensitivity based on pressure, because for all the other drawings, I've kept a sort of a mono widths brush. I don't know how faithful that is to the original keyframes, but for this, it's very clear that brush stroke width is a part of this. I was thinking, let's just try to keep the original shape. And here, I think I am going a little overboard with adding little details, like little droplets, and trying to extend that follow through as far as possible. If I added too much detail with like the follow through of the droplets afterward, you would notice it more. But I felt like maybe all the effort I put into adding those follow throughs of the droplets didn't really amount to much, because you just have a liquid burst and it just goes by and you sort of forget what you just saw. So for the most part, I am trying to stay faithful to the original drawings. In fact, with some of these backgrounds, they're so simple and from a single color that I literally just shape tweens from one to the other. It didn't always work. My whole strategy with that final shot was to, yeah, who is that? Oh, that's CobyPal. Oh, that's cool. You know, I don't know how that ended up in my recording, but you know, the creator of the animations in BFDI and the creator of his own series, The Fridge, CobyPal, you know, he got to see this animation a little bit early before it was done. But yeah, you can see here all I'm doing, which is taking a lot of effort and time, is to break the different parts of two into different shapes that become then shape tweenable. But there's just so much setup required that I really don't think that it's really that much less work, because you still have to be very aware of what shapes are changing from one to the other, and you know, if these in-between shapes are usable at all. There were times where just the feature would break entirely, especially when you have the shape of two's body, and I would have to just draw it manually. You know, two's body is just not the easiest to draw. I tried to really replicate the texture of the original stroke by actually making each individual wobble be smoothed from one frame to the next. That's maybe a little bit overboard, but I think whatever amount that you can make one keyframe be similar to the next will help and will be noticeable. If you have two moving from right to left, maybe you want to show some of those wobbles moving from right to left. And you can see here, this is me sort of fixing up that shape tween. So really, it's not a whole lot less work. But look, so you can see here that, yeah, the shape tween feature is not working for me at all. And then eventually I just have to decide, all right, I'm gonna go back and draw the whole thing manually. And you can see I'm doing it piece by piece with the object drawing mode on. Again, you can toggle that by using the J key on your keyboard. Another feature I'm using a lot is using the E key on your keyboard to use the eraser tool, which I think is really useful when combined with the object drawing mode, because the eraser tool will just sort of punch through all drawing objects without you having to drill into each one. Another thing that I'm doing a lot is sometimes I will try to combine shapes by copying those shapes out of their drawing objects and then pasting them together without drawing objects to protect them from merging with each other. Then I feel like it's really useful to then put that into a drawing object. The trick that I use a lot to do this is I will then press the J key to re-enable the drawing object mode, draw just a tiny stroke, copy the original shape I was going to work with, double click to go into that tiny stroke drawing object, paste the shape there, remove the tiny stroke, and now you have your original shape in a drawing object. So that's like a weird sort of workflow thing that, you know, I think is a pretty good use of the drawing object tool to just put stuff into drawing objects. I wish there was a feature in Adobe Animate to just, in one key, convert a shape into a drawing object. I will say some of the benefits that I really like about drawing objects is that they do protect shapes from merging with each other, but you can still manipulate them as if they were just shapes. So you can still distort them. You can still, like, without having to double click into it, you can drag points of the shape. After doing this project, I have just fallen in love with drawing objects because they make some things in Adobe Animate, when animating frame by frame, so much easier to do. So there are some shapes here. I think, you know, when it comes to these object show style faces, where I feel like the face is all just one color, it's all made out of basic shapes, I think for the most part, it's all shape tweenable. And yet I am still at times drawing those in-betweens manually. But I will say that puffball shape was not the easiest to in-between. There were times where the fact that it was animated on 2s or 3s makes it so that it can kind of hide when a tuft appears out of nowhere or disappears. But then when I have to in-between it, then like, how am I going to make this tuft appear or disappear? It's like animating it on 1s sort of removes the ability to hide some of these inconsistencies. And, you know, that's just one of the benefits of animating on 2s is that you get that chunky Spider-Verse style, but you also get to sort of smooth over. You don't have to be as precise. I think there is a tool that someone has made in Adobe Animate. Oh yeah, see, I'm using it here, I think, that I actually kind of forgot that I had installed, which lets you use a feature that exists in other drawing programs. And that feature is to take overlapping strokes that you've made, cut out the parts where they overlap, and just end up with sort of a neatly joined combination of those two strokes without those like tails after where they cross. I think that's a really nice feature that like Adobe Animate should have built into it. I think there are a lot of features that, if you use any other animation program, you start to feel like, oh wait, why is Adobe Animate so, by comparison, underdeveloped? But at the same time, it's the tool that I know how to use the most and have the most experience with. So you end up making your own sort of workarounds. And one of them is this add-on. I forget what it's called, but I do think it's pretty useful. Although I've used it so little in 2025 that I forgot that I had it installed. But yeah, watching this playback, I'm remembering that, oh wait, that actually was a pretty useful feature. Seeing this playback, seeing this recording is sort of like reminding me of some of the features that Adobe Animate has that it might not have had in the past, which includes strokes of variable width. I don't really know how useful that is for in-betweening maybe more complex characters, but if you're drawing these object show style characters, it might be useful to have a limb not drawn with the brush tool where you have to deal with both sides of a line being separate parts of a shape, but instead maybe just have a single sort of skeleton in the middle that has different widths. Maybe that's a little bit simpler to deal with and maybe more shape tweenable. Speaking of shape tweens, you can see how, yeah, with this background animation, it makes it easier to shape tween those parts of it. I can't really tell if this burst here is supposed to be liquid or if it's supposed to be some sort of seismic wave of energy, but whatever it is, I think my task here is to just make the in-between version of a previous and next keyframe. And that's all I'm doing here. And I really think that with sort of particle effects like these, you really cannot overdo the follow through of those particles disappearing. One of my favorite author animators, Joseph Gilland, who is a Disney alumnus, someone whose book Elemental Magic I really like, he has written about how particle effects, as seen in Disney films, have a lot of manual labor that goes into them, but the idea that fairy dust is one of the most laborious but also rewarding types of particle effects. All of this reminds me that frame-by-frame animation really is just a matter of not necessarily the most creative work, but a lot of manual in-betweening. I will say when it comes to particle effects, it's very difficult to in-between a coarser animated on twos animation and try to sort of smooth over a beginning and end keyframe. I think it's way easier, as Joseph Gilland mentions, to sort of just animate straight on and just sort of plow through based on the previous keyframe. I think it's just way easier to do that because you only have one previous drawing to base it off of. If you do try to make a 2D effects drawing be before and after another keyframe, you just have a lot to think about. And I think that's one of the things that did make in-betweening this animation a little bit more difficult when it came to those liquid effects. It's just way easier to just animate straight on. So we're back to that part of that recording where my recording is frozen. So I'm going to skip ahead again. So one workflow thing that I think really helped with this in-betweening of like very minute details onto, because 2 has such a smooth, consistent motion, is being able to shave away and then add bits of strokes. It's almost as if nudging a stroke is just sort of erasing a bit of it and adding a bit of that stroke on the other side. That's kind of making up for maybe a lack of hand control. If I don't do it perfectly, I can just nudge that line a bit by adding a bit to one side of it and then erasing the other side of it. And I think that's just a sign that when you're animating this minutely, the thickness of a line becomes a part of the animation. And so there were times where I had to adjust the width of the brush just because one keyframe had a thicker stroke than the next one. You're probably already doing this, but in Adobe Animate, I think when it comes to previewing animations, it's that comma and period key or greater than and less than sign keys that you're really like mashing to go back and forth to be able to like preview what the frames look like. I'll say that is one of the keyboard shortcuts that I was using the most. Sometimes I think that trying to jump in and immediately memorize all the keyboard shortcuts is a little bit counterproductive, but I do feel like as you start to use the program more and more, you do start to realize some of these keyboard shortcuts are just really nice to sort of start using like words in a sentence. So for example, what I might do is use the Command B shortcut to break something out of its drawing object, then I might, select multiple of these shapes and then press Command G to then group them into different objects. And I think, over time, you do become fluent in those keyboard shortcuts. Another sort of keyboard thing that I really like to do with the transform tool, which you can switch to by pressing the Q key, is to hold the Alt key, I believe, while dragging one of the handles that's on the sides of the object. So not necessarily the corners, but the sides. And that just makes it so that you can skew the rectangle at the same time that you're scaling it. And it turns the transform rectangle into this like very freeform object that you can use to nudge your drawings to make up for your lack of hand control. So you can see at the bottom of Huffall here, I'm like trying to in between tuft appearing and disappearing. And that is something where like you really do have to do a lot of trial and error, again, by mashing the less than and greater than keys to step between the previous and next frame to really see if this even works as an animation at all. I think a lot of frame by frame animation or doing animation at all is really just like experimenting to see, will this actually be believable as an object appears or disappears from the frame? And if it does work and it's not technically correct, but it feels right, then it is right. Especially with like Flash, if you're animating with puppets, I think the number one thing you're doing when you're animating with puppets is just trying to cover up the differences between one symbol and the next symbol that it's transitioning into. Thankfully, with frame-by-frame animation, we don't have to do that so much. The one thing that I really like about having gone through this whole task of in-betweening these characters is that it's really just been practice to just get better at in-betweening, because I do feel like there is a skill that I really want to get a lot better at, which is making objects feel like they're solid as they move. I think it's so easy to sort of hone in on making individual lines be smoothly moving from one to the next. But there are times where it does become clear when an object is just a drawing and when it's just lines moving around. And sometimes it'll seem like an object is just has no consistent volume or weight to it. And I think one thing I'd really like to do more is do more frame by frame animation, because that is such a like intuitive thing about the feeling of frame by frame animation that I'm not the best at, and something that doing this has become practice with. Yeah, so this is at the very beginning of my task of trying to in between the background, one color shapes. And I think pretty early on, I do realize that it's not really the best use of time and energy to try in betweening things that I could have shape tweened. And yeah, it's that initial burst from the peace sign where there's a shape coming out of it that I'm realizing, oh wait, this is just one simple shape. Why can't I just shape tween it? One argument I would make in favor of using shape tweens a lot is that animation already is a lot of laborious, sort of mind-numbing, not really that much creativity using rote labor. So why not have Adobe Animate do it? I imagine this is a part of Adobe Animate that's been around since the early 2000s. So why not dedicate your creative energy to the animation as a whole, rather than focusing on how precisely you can replicate the contour of a shape with your hand? Why not have the computer do it instead? And then at the same time, because the feature breaks so much, you do have to manually set up things. Like, for example, what I've done here with this ground that has like two sticks coming out of it, even though they're so simple, they still have so many points to them that the shape tween feature breaks a ton. And so I've just broken them off into separate layers. You can see in the timeline, or earlier in the timeline, you could have seen that there were 3 different layers, one for each shape of that background, because it does tend to break so much that, you do really have to hold its hand to even get it to work at all. And as I'm drawing these like scribbles sort of radiating away from Rocky as, Price Tag and Naley are being blown away, is I'm drawing each scribble as a different drawing object, because, again, we don't have the most precise control of our hands. So after I draw it, I can still nudge it around and transform it. And again, the thing that I like so much about drawing objects is that they give you all the benefits of movie clips and symbols and groups, while still allowing you to manipulate the shape inside of it. So you can still, hold down, I think, the Alt key and drag a corner of it and still warp it in a non-affine transform, and it'll still work without you having to drill into it by double clicking or breaking it apart. So to me, drawing objects are just the best of both worlds when it comes to dealing with a number of shapes at the same time in Adobe Animate. I think I snuck in the game of Balatro right there. I know I'm playing Balatro because I have the phone in landscape mode and I barely use that for anything except for that one game. I do really have to commend Colbones for the way that they've made Two's drawing so consistent. Even, from the very first episode of TPOT, already mastering being able to draw Two's body this accurately, moving so smoothly across these many keyframes. I do have to commend them for how well they have mastered the art of drawing too. Maybe another technique that I'm noticing here that I really want to point out is just how useful our humble line tool is to be able to in between different keyframes and make sure that your keyframe is in the midpoint between its starting and end keyframes. Just being able to know the fact that if something lies on a line between 2 points, then that is in the path that a bee or bird would take to fly from one point to the next. So just being able to use the line tool to say, hey, here's our start point, here's our end point. Let's just draw a line temporarily and then use that as a guide for how that drawing should move. And then being able to delete that line, I think is a really useful technique. Another mind-blowing thing that I didn't realize until too late, that you can just use the drawing tools to make things easier for yourself. You can see in this part of this recording that I'm using the line tool to sort of extrapolate which direction is this like C shape, this horseshoe shape, even going to move. And I'm sort of drawing lines to say, you know what? We can kind of be sure that if this curve started here and ended here, that it's going to keep moving in that direction. And we're just using the line tool. I think that's something that really can make in-betweening a lot easier. You can sort of relate this to shape construction. The idea that if you're drawing a cube and then your 3D cube, you draw a line from 2 opposite corners of a square and then the other 2 opposite corners of the square, then that part where those 2 lines cross is going to be the midpoint of that face. And you can be sure that that's the case just because of the way that lines work in general, even in perspective. So I feel like using rules from shape construction in illustration can help you a lot with in-betweening too, even if you're not drawing 3D objects. I think when it comes to those droplets and making them sort of fall apart is it's an exercise in seeing, all right, which parts of this shape are the thickest? And then in the next keyframe, just draw a dot there. And then each next consecutive keyframe, making it a little bit smaller while still trying to maintain its velocity as it moves. Is really just a mini rule, just a simple rule that suddenly if you apply it to lots of water droplets sort of starts to look like a convincing splatter of water. And I think that's one thing that Joseph Gilland talks about in Elemental Magic, which is just that so many of the physical things around us like smoke, dust, water, and fire, those all just are guided by simple rules that then if you just try to apply it to a whole drawing or a whole plume of smoke, suddenly becomes a convincing looking effect. But it is a lot to juggle in your mind at once. And that is why it's just so much easier to animate it straight ahead and not have to in between 2 different drawings. Because now you're dealing with double the drawings that you have to base your smoke off of. Drawing straight ahead, a lot easier than in betweening. Another trick that I'm doing a lot here when it comes to shape tweening the different parts of 2 is sometimes the shape tween will break if I'm trying to shape tween the whole contour of a leg or a foot. And because it's trying to in between both the inside of the line and then the outside of the line. So one thing that you can do instead is just take the inside fill of the shape and then shape tween that. Then once you have your shape tween, convert that into just a normal keyframe, just a static drawing, and then copy it, expand the fill by the same width as your outline is, color it black, and then paste the original shape on top of it. And that'll give you a stroke just by the fact that a stroke is just the original inside shape plus the width of the stroke made black. So I think that's another trick that you can use to sort of debug the shape tween tool, making things a little bit easier when it breaks, just trying different methods to construct the same shape. So maybe you might even color the whole leg black, including the outline, shape tween that, and then take your shape tweens in between, copy it, paste it, shrink it down by the width of the stroke, and then color it the inside color. And that's just another way to construct the same shape that is the leg with both the fill and the outline. One part where you can tell that I'm doing it is when the top outline of a leg gets drawn, because there's no reason for me to draw that normally. But if you do follow this technique, you will end up with an outline around the whole shape. Just like how the shape tween feature breaks a ton when it comes to complex shapes, so is the expand and inset features. So if you do have a shape that you want to give an outline by just expanding it and then turning that expanded version black, sometimes if it breaks and you just end up with like just a broken shape, you can fix that just by, like, I just happen to have it as a shortcut where I press Command Option Shift C to optimize that shape, turning it into a bit fewer points, and then doing the transformation that I want to. Just another way to debug some of the features that might break if you're doing them in Adobe Animate. Maybe one of the other things that I think makes drawing objects so nice is that it lets you animate complex shapes frame by frame with fewer layers. It's almost as if these drawing objects are different layers, but it just makes it so that you can have multiple shapes overlapping each other and not have to worry about them interfering with each other. Because I do feel like once you get too many keyframes and too many layers, it just becomes really cumbersome. So if you can get away with fewer layers, then I think you always should use fewer layers. And drawing objects, I really like because they help you do that. All right, well, now the sun has gone down, and I think just being able to see the light on the windows change so much just reminds you of how much time passes just by being in the world of animation. I think I've said everything I can say about this time lapse. If you happen to notice that the intro to TPOT is smoother now, then you are a genius who is very perceptive, and I thank you for your perceptiveness. See you in the next How Made. My name is Michael H., and goodbye.